Now, we all operate on assumptions, little theories of life of which we are largely unaware. We don't realize that we're assuming things. We don't realize we're taking them for granted. That's what taking them for granted means. You don't have to think about it. It's a part of your life vision or world view, as some people like to call it. It's all in there. It's been in there for years. You've built it up over time, and you don't have to think about it. That's why you're comfortable with it. What you need to understand is that the little assumptions that exist that you live with day in, day out can be major factors in your lack of understanding of things you really need to understand. They can be a major barrier to understanding. Now, one of the ways you know that there is something wrong is when these assumptions, these things that you live with and work with all of your life, and they range all the way from simple little assumptions like, well, the Safeway store has been open on Sunday, and is open 24 hours a day, and this is Sunday, and since it's open 24 hours a day, I assume that it is open. I don't pick up the phone to call them before I drive down there, but I could jump in my car, drive 6 miles down to a Safeway store, but I do this on the assumption that the store is open. We assume all kinds of things. We assume when we get on an airliner to fly from one place to another that it's been inspected. We assume that the man who is at the controls of the airliner has certain training. We just accept these things. We've been told them by somebody, somewhere, sometime. Or we know the government wouldn't let him be up there if he wasn't qualified to be up there. And we know this and we know that. We think we know all kinds of things that we really don't know. We just assume them, and we have to. It's all a part of living. You can't know everything you need to know. You certainly can't even come close to knowing everything you might want to know. So you assume. Now, what was happening to me in 1958 is that one assumption after another was being challenged. Some of them were pivotal. Some of them I did not even necessarily realize that I held. And yet they lay right at the crossroads, right at the intersection of all kinds of things that I believed about the Bible, that I believed about God, that I believed about God's will. I believed in Jesus Christ. I believed that I wanted to do God's will. And yet I had assumed certain things about God's will that had kept me from understanding His will. Very pivotal things, very things that lay right at the crux of what Christianity is all about. One of these pivotal positions for me today, that's what I'm going to talk to you about, was the identity of the God of the Old Testament. Now that may sound kind of strange to your ears for me to say that. Why in the world should I have had a problem with my assumptions relative to the identity of the God of the Old? What do you mean? The God of the Old Testament's God. What do you mean you didn't know about His identity? Well, I mean something very important. I had assumed that the God, or Lord, as He is called, and you notice in your Old Testaments, they generally have the term Lord in all caps. That actually means, that is the Hebrew word YHVH, which one translation, one place in the Bible I think is translated Jehovah, that basically is the name of the God of the Old Testament. I had assumed all my life that the God of the Old Testament, the Lord of the Old Testament, was the Father of Jesus Christ. That He was one and Jesus was the other. My secondary assumption was that Jesus came into existence at His birth some 2,000 years ago, and that prior to that time, Jesus, as I know Him, Jesus the Christ, did not exist, or that is the mind or the being behind that existence. A related assumption was that Jesus and the Father are discrete beings in the same way that my father and I were discrete beings while he was alive. He could be in Houston and I could be here. I could be in Europe and he could be in Texas. We were, and had difficulty communicating. Unless it's by letter or by telephone, that's all we could do. We couldn't see each other. I have, sort of assumed, because that was the way the Bible seemed to present God to me, that that's the way the Father and His Son was. That God was one and Christ was another. And always when I use the term God, I basically referred to the one that Jesus called his Father. In other words, that Jesus was here, God was here, and even though theologically, in an argument or a theological discussion, I might be able to agree that Jesus was God, yet still in my fundamental assumptions is Jesus is here, God is here. Because didn't Jesus pray to God? Now, all these assumptions, now, if you start with these assumptions, if this is all down in you, and you come to certain scriptures, they will seem to confirm what you are assuming to be true. Take, for example, the first chapter of Hebrews, which is where we'll start today. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person, upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high, being made so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. Now, just think about that for a moment. Here we are being told that God, in time past, spoke to the fathers by the prophets. Now, in these last days, he speaks to us by a Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things. Father, Son. This Son, then, is the prophets over here, the Son is over here. Both of them are means whereby God speaks to the world. And so you read that, and you sort of would think, well, that certainly sounds like the description I gave you earlier of what my assumptions were. And based on those assumptions, I would have read this scripture that way. Now, what's funny about this is that I had never in my life, I don't think, up until the point in time, until 30 years ago, articulated those assumptions. I had never tried to sit down with myself or with another person and explain to them, well, here's the Father, here's the Son, here's God, here's the Son. I do remember once struggling for all of 15 minutes with the subject of the Trinity and giving up. Because the way the Trinity was taught, I just, I had to say, or someone actually told me, well, the Trinity is a mystery. Man can't really understand it. And I said, well, I can see why. And I just picked it up, and I went merrily on my way. I decided I don't think I've got whatever it is, but I do see the teaching is the doctrine of the Trinity is true. So I sort of gathered it in among my assumptions, put it on the shelf, went on my way, and said, I guess so. And it was there, as were the other things. As I say, they were not articulated. Now, we need to remember that God reveals himself in certain ways to us, in ways that he is attempting to help us to understand, and in terms that he thinks we will understand. The reality of God is many times, in fact all times, truly beyond our ability to grasp. If we were to come into the presence of God, we would not even be able to look upon him and live, his brightness, his glory. And of course, when you are dealing with that kind of relationship, it's very, very difficult for a human being, to be able to understand it. Now, we also assume that God means what we want him to mean. In other words, when you approach the Scripture with all of your assumptions, you basically want God to mean what you're expecting. You actually will read into the things that he tells you, things that you expect to see there and want to see there. But now we're going to see, as we take a look at that assumption, as we try to decide, well, is that assumption true? We're going to see some things that are rather damaging to it. Now, I want you to take your Bible and turn back with me to the first chapter of John, to one of the most fundamental scriptures that certainly when it comes to a study of Jesus Christ, the New Testament, and the nature of God, the nature of the Father, that you will ever encounter. John, the first chapter, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Now, right off the bat, I have to struggle with something here. Because to say that the Word was with God and the Word was God is contradictory to my assumptions. I assume that when one thing is with another thing, they are not the same thing. In other words, if I am with you, we are two people, aren't we? I cannot be with you and be you. Of course, I obviously can't be you anyway. All I can be is with you. But here we are talking about something that is with. Now, I have my Bible with my notes. My notes are not my Bible, and my Bible is not my notes. And yet if I say my notes are with my Bible and my notes are my Bible, I have, in the English language, given you a contradictory statement. I will also tell you it's contradictory, internally contradictory in Greek. If you assume that our level of understanding existence is all there is, if the level at which you and I are able to understand existences and relationships is the truth, the reality, and all there is, that assumption leaves this verse total gibberish. Because this verse says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, you know, another thing that gives you a problem, language is such a difficult thing that we deal with from time to time. A word to me is something that is either printed on this page or spoken from my lips. Now is a word. Word is a word. This is a word. They are printed, they are spoken, they are written out and scribbled in longhand. These are words. Now, is that what we're talking about here? The Word was God? For if that's true, then we have a word. God is nothing but a word? Or a word has been elevated to God? You see the difficulties you deal with and how we take and glide right over many of these difficulties because of assumptions that we make. Now, fortunately for us, John did not stop here because we are able to go a little further and understand what it is that he is saying. Because of the confusion, many theologians like to go away from the English word here and use the Greek word logos. L-O-G-O-S would be the transliteration into English. And by using the word logos, they are able to remind you that what we are reading here means something a little bit more than just a word spoken out of somebody's mouth. And so a theologian will say that the Logos was with God and the Logos was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, that is, by the Logos, by the Word. Now, generally the assumption in most people's minds is that it was God who created. And indeed it was. But the problem is, what they mean when they say God is that it was the Father who created. That the Father is the God of the Old Testament. He is the one who created the heavens and the earth. Now here, though, we are told that the Logos was God. Does that mean that the Father is not? Is the Logos something other than the Father? Now, I realize that all these things flowing out at you here can become very confusing very quickly, because what I am asking you to do is to think below your assumptions, to move down beneath them and to see what's there, if anything, and to ask questions about them. Are these things true? Is this what this really means? Does this mean what I have always thought that it meant? Because what this verse is about to tell you is that this Logos, who was with God and was God, created the heavens and the earth. In simple terms, it says, in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Oh, at last we've got into something I can understand. Here's a man with 2 feet, and 2 arms and 2 legs and eyes and ears and so forth. He was sent by God, and he had a name, and his name was John. I mean, something I can get with now. The same carrot came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. John was not that light. He was sent to bear witness of the light. That was the true light that lights every man that comes into the world. He, that is that light, was in the world. The world was made by Him. Now, mind you, we've got 2 things for this one we're talking about. He's called the Word. He's identified as God. He is identified as light. And he is identified as the Creator. The world was made by him, but the world did not know him. He came to his own. His own received him not. As many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, who were born not of blood or the will of flesh or the will of man, but of God. Now, any Christian reading this is going to be very rapidly saying to himself, why, that's Jesus. That has to be Jesus. Because when we're talking about those who receive him and given the power to those who believe on his name to become become the sons of God, that has to be Jesus. For there is no other name given whereby we must be saved, other than the name Jesus. He goes on to say, the Word was made flesh. Now I know of no argument advanced by any theologian anywhere that argues that the Father, what we think of when we call him the Father, was made flesh. It was the Son of God who was made flesh, right? It was the Logos, or the Word, that was made flesh. And the one who was God who was made flesh was able to pray saying, Father, to someone else. And that is the one that you and I refer to as the Father. And so that one who is a father can become a grandfather, and so on. And we are able to forget that it is very possible for Jesus also to be referred to as Father, and indeed he is in the pages of our Bibles. Now he goes on to say, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Why is all this important? It's important for this reason. We are very rapidly, as we come down in this verse, identifying the Word, the Logos, as the one who became what we know as Jesus Christ, right? We have suddenly found that this Logos was the Creator of the world upon to which he came and up and down which he walked. Therefore, and that this Word was in the beginning with God. Which means that the one who became flesh existed before his human birth. There went one of my assumptions out the window. Now, as I say, I had not really articulated that as an assumption, but I sort of thought that way. And whenever I was thinking about Jesus and thinking about the Bible, all this was laying in the back of my mind and determining some of the channels in which my thoughts ran, and the way in which I evaluated Scriptures, and the way in which I responded to Scriptures and dealt with them. Now all of a sudden I'm face to face with another question. This one whom I have come to know as Jesus, and I had long since thought I'd been baptized and had the Holy Spirit, and I was a Christian, and I was trying to live a Christian life, and all these things, and all of a sudden I realized that this Jesus that I had heard about, read about, and believed in existed long before he came into being as Jesus of Nazareth and was born of the Virgin Mary. That he was in the beginning with God, and he made the worlds. Now that, as I said, changed some assumptions. And when those assumptions began to change, some other things also had to change. Now he goes on to say, the Word was made flesh, dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and of truth. John bore witness of him and cried, saying, this was he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. Notice, he existed long before John. And of his fullness have we, and by the way, John was born before Jesus was born. And yet John said, he was before I was. Of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. Now, you could wish that writers in the Bible were as careful with their words as we would like to pretend that they are. And this is another assumption that we tend to live by. We tend to assume that if a word means one thing in one place, it has to mean that everywhere else. It's a weak assumption. because you will find any number of illustrations where it is not so. Just as a simple illustration, you and I would like to construct nice, neat little theologies around the use of certain words for law. We would like to talk about the law of God as opposed to the law of Moses. We would like to talk about the Ten Commandments as opposed to ceremonial law. We would like to talk about commandments and statutes and judgments as though there were completely different sets of laws, and you could always tell by the wording used by a biblical writer exactly what he was talking about. Not so. They're just not that careful. So you don't have to worry, though, about that. Generally speaking, you can know what we're talking about. When he says, no man has seen God at any time, he is saying there is somebody of the Godhead upon whom no man has ever laid eyes. He also says that we have, makes it clear we have, and it will become very clear elsewhere, we have seen the Son. Therefore, the one we have not seen is the Father. That little construction is very easy to follow. We have seen the Son. We have not seen the Father. Now, there's some things I think that are very important for us here. You'll turn just a few pages back. I want to add just one little item to what we just saw. In chapter 5, and verse 37, he said, the Father himself, which has sent me, has borne witness of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time, nor seen his shape. So here is the distinguishing thing that we need to understand that he's talking about. He says, no man has seen God at any time. It is the Father that he is talking about. Now, keeping these things in mind, turn back to Colossians. This was one of the things that, again, had to change some of the way we look at God. In Colossians chapter 1, we begin in verse 12. Giving thanks unto the Father, which has made us fit to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who has delivered us from the power of darkness, has translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. Now, all of us who are Christians of whatever stripe are on very familiar and comfortable ground so far. He then said, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, or of creatures. For by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible, invisible, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things consist. What are you going to do with that? There isn't any way of getting around what we're dealing with here. He is talking about Jesus Christ. He said he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. He is the creator. Every throne that has ever existed on the face of this earth from the time man first put a kingdom together, whether it be Jewish, whether it be Gentile, whether it be whatever it may be, owed its ultimate authority to the one you and I have come to know as Jesus Christ. And the creation, all things. This world is a thing, isn't it? I mean, the ground, the earth, the grass, the mountains, the trees, all things were created by him. Who? By the Son. There isn't any way around it. And so consequently, I sat here, and when I think it was either Ted or his dad or one of the literature things that I got back in the early days, just stuck my nose right down this. Well, here went an assumption right out the window, because I had assumed, when I went back in there, it says, and God, created the heavens and the earth in 7 days, and he rested on the seventh day. And I read all these things. I assumed this was the Father doing these things. That it was the Father who created Adam out of the dust of the ground. That it was the Father who breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. That it was the Father who designed and brought these things into existence. It was the Father who took his rib and then closed it up and made a woman out of it. It was the Father who rested on the seventh day. No, it was not. Through the eyes of John, through the eyes of all the apostles who have borne witness of him and of what he did, who tell us, no, he was the creator. He was the one who made Adam. He was the one who made crocodiles and alligators. He was the one who did all these things. The one who finally came into the world, and the world was made by him, and the world didn't even know its maker. Now, to me, that was a pretty important change in my understanding of God's Word and of what he was trying to tell me. It also had to get nailed in a little further for me as I looked a little further, and you turn back to Hebrews the 11th chapter, to come to realize that Jesus was Moses' God. And then when Moses was talking about God, and when Moses was talking with God, and when God was talking to Moses, and when Moses heard the voice of God, it was not the Father. It was the one you and I call Jesus Christ that he was talking to. Hebrews 11 and verse 24. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect to the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt. Faith in who? Christ. Moses did not know him as Jesus. Moses did not call him Christ. He did not use those words. Those phonetic sounds never passed his lips. But the one he talked to, the one he trusted, the one he believed in, and the one for whom he denied and forsook the riches of Egypt was the Son, the Logos, the Christ. Here, of course, is the simple witness to that effect. But if you need another witness to it, turn back to 1 Corinthians. Some people really believe that this is a separate witness, that it was not Paul who wrote Hebrews, that the one who wrote Corinthians was somebody altogether. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I want you to know, I would not that you should be ignorant, how that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual meat. They did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. There went some more of my assumptions out the window. For I had to own up to the fact that the one that Moses had listened to and talked to, that the one who gave them the pillar of fire and the cloud to follow, the one that opened the Red Sea, the one who was with Israel and gave them food to drink and water, and food to eat and water to drink, was the Father. No, it was not. It was Christ who was with them, walked with them, spent time with them in the wilderness. Now, that's not the end of the story. If you'll turn back with me again to the book of John, this time to the 8th chapter, we'll find out something more. John chapter 8 and verse 52. The Jews said to him, that is to Jesus, we know that you have a demon now, because Abraham is dead. He'd been talking about some things about Abraham. Abraham is dead and the prophets, and you say, if a man keep my saying, he shall never taste of death. Can't be, because Abraham kept God's word and he died. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead? And who do you make yourself? Who do you think you are? Jesus answered and said, if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father that honors me, of whom you say, he is your God. But you have not known him, and I know him. But if I should say I don't know him, I should be a liar like you. But I know him. I keep his saying. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. You realize what he's saying? He said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. But Abraham was dead. Abraham was buried. Abraham was not there. And they said, look, you aren't 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Jesus said, verily I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Once again, our language fails us a little bit. And that's an unusual construction. We would never say anything quite like that. But it is accurate. It's intentional. And it's accurate in English and it's accurate in Greek. Abraham was, that is his past tense. He's history. He's over. He's no longer here. His bones are moldering away in a grave somewhere down in Palestine. In fact, I've probably stood within a few yards of where Abraham is buried. He's dead. But he says, then before Abraham was, and he's over, I am. I am is an expression that just basically encompasses, it actually denies time. It exists outside of time. Jesus existed before Abraham, during Abraham's day, and beyond Abraham's day, and here he is standing upon the face of the earth and said, before Abraham was, I am. He could have said, I was, and he would have said one thing. But he didn't feel that was quite accurate, so he said, I am. Which, of course, was one version of his name, which he gave to Moses when Moses wanted to know, what's your name? He said, say, I am has sent you. Now, did the Jews understand what he was saying? It says they all took up stones to cast at him. But Jesus passed through their midst and escaped from them. They accused him of blasphemy. They really believed that he was a blasphemer when he made that statement. Now we need to see then that Jesus was the God of Abraham. And that is a rather profound statement. Now with that in mind, turn back to Genesis, would you? Genesis chapter 18. We'll put a couple of more scriptures together and think a little bit about what we found. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 1. And the Lord appeared to him, that is to Abraham, in the plains of Mamre. The Lord did. Yahweh did. Jehovah did. Now, when we get over to John, and we read Jesus' own words about how that no man has seen God at any time, nor heard his voice. John says it's just nobody has ever seen God. Now we find that Abraham, that this Lord appeared to Abraham. Then what we are seeing here is something other than what you and I would have called God. We think of God as being the Father. Well, who is this that appeared to Abraham at this point in time? It's the God of Abraham. You've heard people talk about the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Who is that person? Well, it took somebody to introduce me to them and to make me realize that this God of Abraham was none other than Jesus Christ. He lifted up his eyes, he saw three men that stood by him, and he ran out to meet them. Now the story is the story of what God did when he went down to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But notice in verse 18 or 17. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is very great and grievous. Now he's speaking now to Abraham. This are words that God himself, that Jesus Christ, who was God, said to Abraham. Behold, the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Their sin is very grievous. I am going down there now to see if it's true. And if it is, I will know. Abraham drew near and said, Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure, there be 50 righteous within the city. Will you destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? The story is so familiar, I won't go on. Abraham steps up. Not only is he able to see God, not only is he able to hear the Lord, he is able to bargain with the Lord, and they have a give and take discussion, and the Lord changes what he's going to do because of all this. Who is this? It's the one you and I have come to know as Jesus Christ, none other. And that the gentle shepherd who was born in the manger, the little Jesus child, the gentle shepherd of the sheep, the one that everyone paints as being that wouldn't harm a flea, the one who would not quench a smoking flax, was the one who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with fire and brimstone. None other. You know, it is almost as though, and the little hidden assumption lies under there, that the God of the Old Testament is harsh and strict, and the God of the New Testament is gentle and kind, and that you have one back here that won't budge an inch, and one over here that will just give you anything and everything, and one over here that is hard, and one over here that is gentle and kind, and so on. Not so, folks. It's precisely the same mind that you are dealing with in both Testaments. The one that you and I have come to know as Jesus Christ. Now, if you'll turn back a few more pages, there's a strange circumstance that takes place in the 7th chapter. See, I have the right place. Genesis 14, yes. verse 17. The king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham after his return from the slaughter of the kings that were with Kedorlaomer at the valley of Shaveh and the king's dale. They had come in, and this was before the destruction of Sodom. They had taken captives out of Sodom, including Lot and his family. So Abraham put all of his men together, went out and fought and rescued them, and all the goods and the booty they'd taken out of Sodom and Gomorrah, and was bringing them back. And we're told that the king of Sodom came out to meet him, but another personage also came to meet him, a personage whom I do not believe would have been in Sodom. It says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, tithes of all. Now that simple little instance taking place here is he coming back from the slaughter with, who knows, $1 million worth of booty. And here comes a priest out to him, and he carves out 10% of it, even before he gives back to the king of Sodom what was his. And he gives 10% of all that to Melchizedek. This is a very significant act. If you'll turn back to Hebrews chapter 7, I'll help you to understand what's actually going down here and what we can learn. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 1. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being by interpretation. This is the name, Melchizedek. This is who he is. Being king of righteousness, after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, abides a priest continually. What sort of personage could this possibly be? I mean, what does it mean when you say that someone is without father, without mother, without descent? Well, someone argued to this effect that, that means he just simply that there was no genealogy for this man. But wait, it goes on. It says he has neither beginning of days nor end of life. Now, how many individuals, beings, what have you, could there possibly be in the universe that we're living in, who have neither beginning of days nor end of life? Do you realize what's another word for someone who has no beginning of days nor end of life? Eternal. Who is eternal? Well, that's what the name YHVH or Yahweh or some people like Jehovah means. It means the eternal, ever-living one, the one without beginning of days nor end of life. This Melchizedek that came and met Abraham and accepted tithes from him was God, was the eternal, the one that we meet again and again throughout the pages of the Old Testament, the one whom we call God and whom we may have assumed was the Father of Jesus Christ. But we're going to find out a few things more about this. He said he is without father, without mother. He abides a priest perpetually. Now consider how great this man was, and to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Now you realize that the tithe, many people I don't think really do realize, that what the tithe was an act of worship. That it was something which one who was a lesser person did to one who was greater, and acknowledging the greatness of this other person, or the supremacy, or the power of the other. And so Abraham, who was by the Hebrews who got this letter, considered the greatest man in Hebrew history. He was the father of the faithful. He was the man of all Israel. He said, I want you to understand then how great Melchizedek was, because even Abraham paid tithes, acknowledging the greatness of this one Melchizedek. Who is this person? He says, verily, they that are the sons of Levi, who receive the office of a priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, even though they themselves come out of the loins of Abraham. He whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Which was the greater? which was the less. Abraham was the less. Now he's writing to people who have a fixation on the temple and upon Levi, and who think that the Levitical priesthood is the pinnacle of the service of God. Here he said, men who die receive tithes. There he receives them of whom it is witnessed, he is alive. And so I may say, Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. He's establishing through this the greatness of the Melchizedek priesthood, that it is greater than Abraham, and consequently it is greater than Levi, who was out of the loins of Abraham and would have to look up to and back to Abraham. He then goes on to say, if then perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? The priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also in the law. What law? Any law that had anything to do with the priesthood, including the law of tithing, which existed before Levi, existed after Levi, that Abraham paid tithes, Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek because Levi was in the loins of Abraham, figuratively speaking. And so it is. One who received tithes then can receive tithes now. Who was that person? He is the one who was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, the one whom we know as Jesus Christ. For of he of whom these things are spoken, to just make the point as to who he's talking about in verse 13, pertains to another tribe of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And yet he is established as a priest of the order of Melchizedek, and in fact is none other than Melchizedek. The God, the Lord, the Jehovah, the Yahweh of the Old Testament is the one you and I know as Jesus Christ, as the Logos of God. And you know, this has some far-reaching implications. There can be arguments made, theological constructions, and all sorts of ideas, but there are some things that still come home, and they are truth. And they do shake some of the old assumptions. One, when a voice called out to Moses and called him up Mount Sinai, whose voice was it? It was the one you and I know as Jesus Christ. When one spoke to him out of the burning bush and said, take off your shoes, the ground on which you stand is holy, who's talking? The one you and I know as Jesus Christ. And when a fiery finger wrote 10 commandments in tables of stone, whose finger was it? It was the finger of Christ, the one you and I know as Jesus of Nazareth. When the Lord began to pronounce laws and began to tell Israel how to live their lives, who was it who was saying all these things? It was the one you and I know as Jesus Christ. When the Lord told Israel as a part of all the laws, these are the animals that you shall not eat, who was that? It was Jesus Christ. That's who. It was the one we call the Son. It was Jesus. He's the one that gave all those laws regarding slavery. He's the one that gave all those laws regarding animal sacrifices. He's the one that told them where to keep the feast, when to keep it, how to keep it, and what to do. He's the one that gave them all those laws relative to all the holy days. And even all those laws that we look back on and can't figure out why in the world God ever wanted anyone to do those things, those were all given by Jesus Christ. And when he said, look, these animals here are unclean, and these are abomination, who said that? Jesus did. You know, little children don't know what's clean. They will actually play in their own stool. You know, they don't have any idea that there's anything wrong with it. That's, as far as they can tell, that was moments ago a part of them. And they play in it. They think nothing of it. And the mother has to come along and say, no, that's nasty. One of our favorite little words, nasty. You know, teach children, nasty is a nasty word. It sounds nasty. You know, it feels nasty to say it, and it really conveys nasty. It's filthy. The word abomination in Hebrew comes from the original word is filth. And what you read when you read through that Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 about clean and unclean meats, it's coming along and God says, that's nasty. He's basically telling people who wouldn't know the difference between what was good and what was bad, when it was clean and what was not clean, and what was not only merely unclean, it was awfully, it was filthy, it was nasty. Well, God had to tell them. Who was that? It was Jesus who told them that. Now, as I said, you can make lots of arguments and theological discussions, till the cows come home, about what Jesus meant when he said certain things and whether he was making meats clean or what have you. But you do need to keep in mind when you're doing all that he was the one that told them they were nasty in the first place. That was the one. Now he's coming along and he is going to tell them that things aren't quite like I told you they were then. They are different from that somehow. Think about that when you're constructing the theological arguments that go around with clean and unclean meats, the Sabbath day, because the one who originally rested on that Sabbath day after creation was none other than Jesus Christ. While we're, as I said, putting all these arguments together, there are a couple of other things we might want to keep in mind. James, chapter 1, in verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. No variableness, neither shadow of turning. Just how much doing away with, casting aside, modifying is God going to do anyway with things that he told? And you have to ask questions that nobody seems to want to discuss when we're discussing what was abolished out of the Old Testament. Well, if it was abolished, why was it ever put in the first place? What's the point? What's the object? Where was it going? And then if there was some other question left, now that we know who that God was, turn back to the 13th chapter, just a page back in my Bible, the 13th chapter of Hebrews, and verse 7. Remember them which have the rule over you, which have spoken to you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation, or the goal, or the purpose, and where they're going. Jesus Christ, the same, yesterday, today, and forever. Now, I wonder how far back yesterday is supposed to go. What about, maybe he didn't mean day before yesterday. Maybe he just meant yesterday. But you and I know that that's not true. And when he makes the statement, Jesus Christ, the same, yesterday, today, and forever. Whatever it was that caused Jesus Christ to call Moses up at Mount Sinai, whatever it was that caused him to chisel those 10 words on those tables of stone, whatever it was in his mind, his consciousness, whatever purpose he had in establishing the laws regarding slavery and sacrifices and clean and unclean meats in the holy days, whatever it was, he has not changed. Whenever you begin to put your theological constructions together, think about that. Jesus Christ is the same, yesterday, today, and forever. And as he continues, be not carried about with divers and strange doctrines, all sorts of new ideas and new novelties. Take a new look at that God of the Old Testament. Consider who he is after all, and it will change the way you relate to the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New.